Hello and welcome to BloombergQuint. We have with us today DIPAM Secretary, Mr. Tuhin Kanta Pandey. Hello, Mr. Pandey. Welcome to BloombergQuint. Uh, I would like to start by asking you this question that the biggest contributor to deficit in revenue target in FY21 was a lack of disinvestment in this year, in the fiscal year, which is just going on. Can you explain what really happened this year? Why are we laggards in disinvestment?
I think I think I'd like to correct that statement. The biggest, because the disinvestment itself is a very much smaller pie of the total thing. I think, COVID pandemic, how it impacted the world, and I think the revenues plummeted because, ultimately the revenues depend on, the growth, and when there were lockdowns and the pandemic was raging all around the world, the revenues plummeted, and so was in Indian case as well. So not to correct to say that it is only because of disinvestment that we couldn't achieve the target. Disinvestment equally was impacted, very severely by the point is that we are talking of disinvestment of PSUs, and it is not that we are dealing with telecom companies or in other companies or IT companies, which were actually much in demand even during the pandemic. Most of the PSUs, if you would see that they are in infrastructure sectors, and they suffered pretty badly, these sectors. So therefore, obviously, the disinvestment was impacted, and more importantly, the strategic disinvestment, which has been of late the focus of our attention, gets affected because the management control, when you have to pass on, and obviously the universe of bidders is much smaller, and most of them are our global invites. So unless and until we have the bidders who are interested, then obviously we can't go ahead with those transactions. Fortunately, that is behind us now, and we have moved on the disinvestment track.
So you're saying there was a lack of appetite in the market. That's why it led to a big shortfall in the disinvestment
Absolutely,
proceeds.
because some of our key transactions, which were big ticket transactions, those transactions had already been, started pre-COVID, but they were, unfortunately, the timing was such that immediately when we had to receive the AOIs, etc., the COVID struck. And some of our key disinvestments were in terms of oil and aviation, which were indeed the sectors they were immediately very much hit by the pandemic.
So the privatization of BPCL and others in the pipeline, as you rightly mentioned right now, are one of the reasons which will be an important factor in maintaining the fiscal deficit target that we have right now in the next fiscal year as well. So where are we in terms of the pipeline that we already have?
I think again, I would rather say that it is we should not look at disinvestment only from the point of view of fiscal deficit risk. I think that's a very short-term view of, it's actually disinvestment of the kind which we are envisaging, which Honorable Finance Minister announced yesterday, is a very bold structural reform. And it is supposed to be, I mean, we have been waiting for this for a long time, because the last set of privatization that happened were way back, indeed an NDA government prior to 2004. So we have a long hiatus, and all what we were doing was minority stake sale, which has its limits, because ultimately, in terms of efficiency, you can bring in a certain amount of efficiency through public listing and public ownership. Of course, over a period of time, our listed companies are much more widely owned now. Government is, of course, in the control, and more than 51 in several companies, but there is a large holdings. But nevertheless, that is not really same thing as actually privatization. And this is the first time, a directional shift has taken place. And I think it should not be actually viewed as just doing the math numbers, because ultimately, it is the revenues that give you the strength. Because if you look at the huge amount of expenditure that we have, it just can't be met from disinvestment. I mean, after all, what is the If you look at the total market cap of government equity, it's about 6 lakh crore. So you can't go for enormous amount of disinvestment only to plug the gap. So you have to look at it from that point of view.
So when we expect the pipeline disinvestment companies being targeted for disinvestment in the coming months, or what is the timeline for BPCL or Air India in your plan?
Well, I think there is a clear statement by Finance Minister in the budget. There's a certain transactions, certain companies like BPCL, Air India, Pavan Hans, BEML, Shipping Corporation of India, Concord. These are and NINL. These are likely to be concluded. So there is a very clear statement that these transactions will be closed.
By when can you tell the timeline to
It
us?
will be, one after another. Maybe some transactions can be closed in the month of maybe April, May. It's like you carry on with those transactions, and that the transactions have a certain amount of time, because when you pass on the management control, there are three key things there. First, the expression of interest, and those have to that will be certain entry barriers would be there in terms of net worth, etc., which have to be crossed. And then there is a due diligence phase in which they get into deeper analysis of the companies, because they are taking over management control. So it's very different from just investing in stocks in the market, which can be done fairly quickly. One can exit and get in and out of the stocks in the stock market very easily. But when you get into management control, you would be stepping into a driver's seat. So you would like to look at every contract, of course, under the confidential undertaking. You would get into the data room, analyze, see the assets, and then there'll be a share purchase agreement, and then there would be, once this is agreed, then there is an RFP where the bidding will be done, the competitive bidding. So obviously, we have to go through those rigorous processes that we have designed for ourselves, and rightly so, because we are dealing with the sale of public assets.
Can you talk of LIC IPO, because that's also a major announcement by the government that was done in the previous budget. So now we are here with the next budget itself. So what is happening there?
I think the budget which you keep referring to, you think that you seem to presume that as if nothing has happened in the interim. When we are saying that this is a pandemic of the century, and the whole government, across the government, we have got into resuming work, managing survival at the time, giving the essentials, then making the things function through electronically. We had even physical distancing, social distancing, advisors. We have all connected during this time, and still we were able to do, and we have reached 20,000 crore disinvestment receipts, and about 18,000 crore of dividend receipts. Put together, we've about 36,000 crore. All of this has happened during the pandemic time. So please note that the budgets which are pre-COVID anywhere in the world could not actually keep the promise, because the context totally changed. So let us take that out. What matters is whether we have an intention to move ahead, whether we are moving ahead, whether the progress is being made, and finally, what is the directional shift that the government is indicating. And Finance Minister made it very clear in her statement that we will, now we have a new policy where we said 4 sectors, strategic sectors, where we will keep bare minimum presence, and rest of the sectors we will exit. Even in those sectors which we are strategic, we are only retaining the minimum presence going forward. So which means that it opens up a new program, which I would say the boldest ever program, the privatization program, which will roll over. And of course, it will be carried on over the next 4 or 5 years. This will be, I think, the biggest structural reforms after 1991.
When you talk about the new disinvestment policy, what was announced in May was that up to 4 companies, state-owned companies, will remain in the strategic sector. Now we have no mention of these 4 as a cap in terms of state-owned companies in strategic sector. So are we not sticking to that 4 as a number, or are we flexible now more that there can be more companies than 4 in certain sectors
No,
as
I
well?
think that was an announcement which was later analyzed through a process of interministerial consultation and deeper analysis. In terms of sectors also, initially, much more sectors were intended to be kept. Those sectors have been squeezed down based on the need that where do we want the retained presence for? Why do we retain the presence for? Wherever the competitive markets have come of age, where the private sector is very well entrenched and well in place, there probably government need not be there. So if it is question of a national security, it is a question of energy security. If it is a question of critical infrastructure, like transport and communication, if you have very important financial services. So, barring these, where the minimum presence will be kept, the other sectors have now been left open, where so this provides an opportunity for private sector to do brownfield investments in terms of and bringing in a lot of efficiency and productivity and growth and investment. See, when you are taking over the assets, and if you look at the economic survey of the last year, and you would really have a specific instances of how those pre 2004 companies, those were privatized, have performed. So we have got fair amount of data, how what happened to employment, what happened to profitability, what happened to growth, what happened to return on capital employed, what happened to the volume of production. So if we want an Atmanirbhar Bharat, we want a lot of production at low cost, at in great quality, and which we feel that when we have a greater opportunity for the private sector, which we have now and which we are offering, it will be available. Like if you are making pharma, then it doesn't mean that the pharmaceuticals have to be produced in public sector. Pharmaceuticals have to be produced in India.
So
That's important.
So the question is that can there be more than 4 state-owned companies in certain strategic sector? Can there also be more than 4?
I mean, this is an analysis needs to be done because there is also an issue of how you are going to roll out. Because when you are saying a directional shift of a policy stays for a long time. Policy is not for a year. And please remember, this is a directional shift. Now you know that, well, there is no need. Number one, you won't really be having multiplicative of companies in those sectors which are non-strategic. So there is that urge to get into a newer public sector undertakings that should stop. The secondly, those which are there, they have to be also lifted up, because you cannot also disinvest, always when the things are really in a bad shape. I mean, after all, what do we want? We want more production, more productivity, more efficiency, better quality, and growth. And these are things that can be spurred through this element of structural reform for an Atmanirbhar Bharat.
When we talk about privatization of banks that has been announced in the budget, we heard in the press conference yesterday that there could also be a route taken where the amendment to the law would not be required. Can you explain us how the government is thinking about with the privatization of the banks?
I think FM has made it clear that there will be a need for amendment to act if you really want to go, if you want to say privatize banks, then obviously we require a change of act, change of legislation. Wherever the legislation prevents it, that is to be enabled. IDBI Bank, for example, which is not in the same league as public sector banks, in the RBI lists as a private bank, because LIC owns 51% and government owns 47%. So, but actually it is viewed by the market in the nature of a public sector bank only, because LIC is again publicly owned and the government is also as an important partner. So put together, they view it as, because the management is looked at as a public sector management. So that was also made very clear. And the IDBI Act amendment is a part of the Finance Act, where it will be enabled that the license which it has got, it will be, continued. post disinvestment. So that amendment is being a part of that proposed amendment is a part of the Finance Act.
So while shaping the disinvestment policy, the new policy, did we have in mind a number of total number of public sector banks that we need in the country right now, or that we will see in the country going ahead? Because two banks will be privatized, a lot of banks have been merged. So how many public sector banks are we targeting?
I mean, again, this question was also asked of FM in the press conference, and she replied that if we had a very clear answer, she would have told so in the budget. This is a policy announcement, and that will be carried forward. I mean, it will be analyzed, and due decisions will be taken at the right time.
Oh, there are a lot of things that are happening. New disinvestment policies in place. We are seeing privatization of banks, one general insurance company, and we also have a pipeline of disinvestment that is going to come in the next financial year. Even then, the disinvestment target is less than what it was in the pre-pandemic year. So, is there any reason why we have kept it at a lower level?
I think you're obsessed with from the fiscal angle, and that's what I think you're not really catching up the significance of what I intend to do. Because you always look at the fiscal as a gap filling, as something which is a sale. You're not looking at what is the employment potential, what is the structural reforms that it will unleash, because it is what is the animal spirits that it can potentially trigger, where is going forward in a pandemic year, and just in the post pandemic year. What we are saying is that because it's very important that the private sector interest is to come in. I mean, it is a slightly difficult to gauge why the public investments are being targeted on such a wider scale. Obviously, private sector investment can come in. So why should public sector be investing? The reason is that when the private sector, is real tepid in decision making, and they probably react with a certain lag when things look up and the demand looks up. And as the private sector, trying to sort of revive the capital formation sentiment, it is the government which can give a initial push to demand through the infrastructure creation. And the same thing is true with this investment. You would obviously be, as the interest in the private sector revives, we could always do that. After all, estimates are estimates. What we don't want is a constant question of this filling up gap, because basically if you are to look up disinvestment only from the fiscal maths, I mean, should we be just selling at whatever the price? I mean, should we not look at the valuation of our stocks? Should we not be really saying that those who buy our stock, those investors, should be disregarded? What do you want? So the market should know that it is we intend to do, and our focus will be on strategic disinvestments. But strategic disinvestments also envisages, because it's not a one-side clap. There has to be a two-sided. We should have a larger interest in people interested in our undertakings to come over and take over undertaking. And as we see the revival of that, we can speed it further.
That's a very interesting point you made on the valuation, because valuation is a very key aspect, which is the reason why we were held up on not privatizing banks, because the valuations of the banks were very low. So when do we see that the right time to enter into the market?
The valuation of the banks, the valuation is also dependent upon controls. You will probably, if you have one kind of a valuation, why is it that, in some cases when the public sector disinvestment is announced of a company for strategic sale, that means privatization, many times we'll see that the stocks rise. So why do the stocks rise? Because, probably the market is actually giving more marks to the private players in terms of their capacity to take that company forward. So therefore, valuation is also dependent upon control in many sense. When you do not, when the control remains the same, the stocks somehow actually sometimes get stuck on a certain range. What the market is saying, how the company is doing well. If the company is doing well in the public sector control also, they value it. So the issue is that we have to have a constant interaction and dialogue and feedback from the market in order to do that. And that is a very important part of this. And when you just stuck up with one number and this thing, I think you make a mistake of really seeing that how the transactions and disinvestments actually get culminated. They don't really, if it just goes one target number and said, come what may, I will sell. That's, I'm afraid, not the strategy we are going to adopt.
Very interesting point, sir. Last question. On Air India, when do we see that the name of the entities will be revealed which have expressed interest in Air India already? When do we expect that to happen?
Again, that's not going to happen, because the entities, we will reveal them when the deals are finalized, because the competitive bidding process, and you can appreciate in any competitive bidding, if it is revealed to one player as to who else is bidding, that's not in the interest of the competition. The interest of the competition is that the people, not knowing who are bidding, they should bid for the best price.
So when is the next?
So I think we are for the best price.
So what is the next stage in Air India disinvestment? So to say, what is the timeline? Just that
I think that has been made clear, that I think the timeline will be very soon in the next financial year.
Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.